I did have another question that just came in my mind as we were talking about this. And this is an interesting question because let's say you really manage to make a lot of things more locally. So you have local relationships with people who perhaps produce food, and you buy this food, and in return perhaps you produce some furniture and you sell them furniture, or like you are really kind of, what's the right word, enveloped in this local community. Isn't that also in some sense a form of being dependent? Because now you are, of course, dependent on your local community. And I think through the biggest time of human history, people have been very, very heavily dependent on their local communities. And I guess one freedom that this whole big modern industry has given many people is that they can now choose to move away from their local community, or move away from people who are perhaps also sometimes difficult or annoying, or have their own undesirable behaviors. And so isn't there always some kind of dependency? It's just perhaps in one thing or in another thing?
Well, I have 2 points about that. The first point would be that, well, technically speaking, you could try to live really radically independent and try to be self-sufficient, even with regards to the local community. Let's say you grow your own food, and you have you are a carpenter, for instance, and you have your own little industry in your own garage, let's say, and you make things yourself, you grow your own food. By that process, you could become very independent from anyone, whether it is local village or huge industry. So that's one point. And also one could argue that, even though I would absolutely agree that in villages and local communities, there is interdependence, there is dependence on others, but it seems that you are, compared to today, you are more able to care for yourself and do things yourself than today. Even though there's a lot of cooperation and the social life is very integrated, you still have certain independence in that you can, to a larger extent than today, make things yourself. I think people were more able to create basic products of carpentry, for instance, that it would be today. That's not something I'm an expert on, but that's my suspicion or impression. Now, my second point is that, yes, it seems that we are dependent on other human beings, and that seems to be related to human nature. Human beings are by nature social animals. We form communities, we form societies, and we will have our lives be dependent on other human beings to a certain extent, and other human beings will be a part of our life. That is human nature. But in situations where you have small local communities doing things more natural, being somewhat more self-sufficient and localized, that sort of dependency seems to be better than the dependency on huge modern structures and industries, because you now have, say, neighbors or members of the extended family that you know on a personal basis. They are particular individual person deep level, and you can have this personal trust with them, and you can feel that I am actually part of a community that I belong to. It is a part of my life, even a part of the identity, you could say. And it seems more healthy and natural and good for human nature. I would say that it actually is that, than to have this large company which treats you as an individual piece in a huge abstract entity called the customers or the consumers, a mass of people, just like the welfare state would treat all its subjects, if we can be called that, as a mass called the people, or it takes all its revenue from this abstract entity called the taxpayers instead of treating of particular individual persons. Now, of course, if you have a local community and you have these other people, neighbors, extended family that you're dependent on, some of these people would not necessarily be pleasant people. They might be bad people, and you might have a bad chemistry with them. But that seems to me to be just inevitable. That's something we have to deal with anyways, bad and good people. But generally speaking, it is much more natural and good to have family structure.
I mean, I see your point, and I think one important consideration is that, as you said, human beings are social animals, and there is dependence on other human beings, and that's not really avoidable. And so the question is not, would you rather have dependence or no dependence, but what are the advantages and disadvantages of different kinds of dependence? And I think that I don't know. I think it's also a little bit of a personal preference. So, because for me, I have to say there are certain people who can live, for example, in very small villages where everybody knows everybody and everybody knows what everybody did in the last 10 years. And I actually, at least I think at the moment, that I prefer to live in a little bit more anonymous kind of setting as I am living right now. And so, because sometimes I don't really want some people who perhaps as we said, some people are a little bit annoying or a little bit difficult, or have just a different view of how things should be done. And I don't really care to have to discuss with them all the time about whether I should do something different or why I'm doing it the way I'm doing it, etc. So I'm not sure exactly for me, because I think the model with huge centralized piles of resources is also not the one that I like, the one of the golden cage that we have been discussing in the first part of this conversation. But I think the free market model is actually the one that I like quite well, because there you have you have kind of the advantages of both worlds. You have on the one side the advantage of being able to move much more independent of your neighbors, or deciding things independent of the approval of your neighbors. And at the same time, you still have you are still yourself in control of your resources, and you can avoid some of these problems that this way of socialized consumerism bring about.
Interesting thoughts. Well, I had this thought while you were speaking, that one could perhaps have a mixture of the country life on the countryside with villages, small towns, and things like that, and also having cities. And when I'm thinking of the city, I'm not necessarily thinking of the modern city with all these very large huge structures of large centralized infrastructure and large tall skyscrapers and all that. But let's say more traditional cities, like the cities around Italy in the Renaissance era, or the 14th century, even the 13th century, or cities modeled after the classical Greek model with Athens and other small cities like that. Now, I'm not that much familiar with how those models worked, but it seems to me to have been a larger kind of community than small villages. So you could be a little bit more anonymous, but still feel that you're part of a community. So perhaps there could be a mixture that you both have the countryside and then you have the cities. And if you have someone who wants to move away from that small village he's born out of, well, then he can spend his time in the city, perhaps marry someone in the city and start a family, for instance. So perhaps there can be this element of choice that if you would rather have a different kind of life, well, you have the ability to move either to another kind of village or just to the city. So you would still have roots in where you were born, of course, because your family would still be present at that village in which you grew up, and you will still always have this relation, and you should always have that in mind. But perhaps you could talk about a little bit of choice in that regard. So I'm not sure if that would be an application of what you refer to as the free market, but that is at least one thought I have, because I would say that to have this local community is very natural and valuable and good for human beings. But at the same time, when to address those problems you brought up, you could perhaps have this element of choice between the village and the city. But this, of course, is something one could think more about. So this is just some initial thought I had about that subject.
Yes, I think for me the interesting realization here is that there is always, as far as you are a social being and interact with other humans, there is a certain amount of dependence that just comes with life. The question is more on what will you be dependent, and not so much can you be more or less dependent, but it's just where is the dependence focused. And there it seems to me that there is some aspect of personal preference, and that was, I think, one thing. The other thought is also just for me. So for example, I really love philosophy, and as it seems you love philosophy too. And there are, however, in most places, there are not very many people who are very much into philosophy, because in most companies that I kind of, if some friend has a birthday or if some family gathering happens or so, most people are actually not interested in these philosophical questions at all. They are quite annoyed if you start to talk about them for longer than maybe 5 minutes. And so it seems to me like the fact that you are from Norway and I am from Switzerland, and we are having this conversation, which we will then put on YouTube, is a little bit of a performative contradiction to the fact that we are talking about how small localized communities are better for people to live in. Because then why am I not in the coffee down the street and talking to the people who are sitting there?
Interesting points you bring up. Well, technically speaking, it would be a performative contradiction if we just said right now, no one should have YouTube conversations, or no one should talk digitally. But I saw your point. Yes, when you were talking about this, I was thinking about the role of academia or the university in this regard, because even in the Middle Ages, where you had a very strong societal basis in villages, where small local communities had a very strong root and people were really belonged to such a community, still you had universities being established all over Europe, and you had thousands, even tens of thousands of students who attended these universities, and I think they moved from place to place, and they gained, you could say, an independence from their origin, the village they grew up in. And I think the life in the academy or the university would perhaps be a solution here, because if you really care about philosophy like we do, then you could seek the university life and study philosophy, and there you will meet lots of other students who have the same interests as you, but they might come from very different places. They grew up in different places. And I think this would be a good model, you could say. So we have a combination between small and strong local communities having a lot of things in common, but also you have university life, which transcends even nations, just as it did in the Middle Ages. And also you can have cities like the cities in Italy. So that could perhaps be an interesting combination to have in a society.
Yes, I think what I thought of as you said this is kind of because I agree with you. I think this is a good solution, and it goes again to this principle of subsidiarity, of making things as large as necessary and keeping them as small and local as possible. And so there are, even, let's say you are now a university student, and the students with whom you have an intellectual exchange come from all over Europe. But still, the groceries that you eat, they could come just from the next village. So different aspects of life can be organized on a different scale. And I guess it would be a little bit of a process of continuous improvement to find the optimal scale for each aspect of life. So, and as we said, perhaps insurance should be probably larger than the scale of food production, because you need a certain amount of people to spread the risk over. But at the same time, it shouldn't be so large that it becomes completely ridiculous because somebody is living in a very warm place, but is also paying for insurance against snowstorms, for example, just because you made the pot of people so large that it's no longer representative of the local conditions. So I guess different aspects of life could be or should be organized over different scales.
Interesting. And when you were mentioning insurance there, I also had these ideas about insurance that could be really interesting. And I think this was practiced more back in the day. And that's to have insurance being integrated in, let's say, an extended family structure, where all the members of an extended family, they have a little sum of money that they pay into this common cause. You could say that the capital of the family. And if any member of the family got really sick or got in a huge crisis, then a lot of money from that pool will be used to help that person. And also I had this, I remember this old practice of the mutual aid societies. Have we talked about the mutual aid societies before?
Perhaps on the side, but not as a central part of a conversation.
Okay, right. Because for those who don't know in the audience, the mutual aid societies were a large system, or I wouldn't say system, but there were many groups or small societies established in the Western world, in the United States, in Great Britain, and in Australia, and probably many other places as well, including Norway. And these were small groups of people, for instance, immigrants. Let's say you have a group of immigrants migrating to the United States, who got together and established some small society or small community
where they had this common pool of money, and they each paid a little sum into that pool. And if any of these members got sick or needed to go to the doctor, the mutual aid society would take care of that. And that worked very well. They actually managed to get a lot of good healthcare products and services for a very, very low price. Actually, there was this point made by a person that a wage that you made in one day as an average worker, that was enough to cover an entire year of visits to the doctor. So that was a very workable enterprise, or I wouldn't perhaps call it enterprise, but rather mutual aid society. And that was practiced among immigrants from certain places. Let's say you have a group of immigrants from China, and they had their own little Chinese immigrant mutual aid society. And you had hundreds of these in the Western world. And you could call that a sort that was practiced in that sense. Unfortunately, this system of this life of mutual aid societies were largely replaced by the modern healthcare industry. And it seems that the American Medical Association, a labor union for doctors essentially, cartelized the doctor industry, and there were many other government regulations. Then you had the government welfare state, and all of that were placing that old model, unfortunately. And then you got from cheap and good quality healthcare services to all the problems we have today. So it's a very tragic development. But that is a very interesting model to study, and that I think could be very relevant to finding alternatives when it comes to insurance.
Yes, I think that's a good input that you mentioned there, and perhaps I will try to read something about this. I had this on my list already, but yeah, I think this is a good input, and I also absolutely believe that it worked very well until the government stepped in and started to provide this service to everyone and make it mandatory, and from then on it just probably over time got more expensive and less practical. That's oftentimes happened already.